All right. The hood, the circus, jungle, dysfunctional, unorganized, no values, no morals, anti intellectual are all words that were used by teachers and administrators to describe the neighborhood and students who lived in the concentrated poverty neighborhood where I conducted my ethnographic research for my dissertation. While many of the school personnel wanted to close the achievement gap, they were unable to acknowledge the double burden that students and family members over generations have encountered that caused many of them to have distinct routes, test scores, and outcomes. Today, within my time, I would like to offer more complexity to the myopic views that are associated with people who live in concentrated poverty. I would like to do this by first acknowledging who is in concentrated poverty, second, tracing the roots and routes of concentrated poverty, and thirdly, by examining how it impacts its residents, particularly students. Since 2000, 5 million more Americans are in concentrated poverty. Right now, we are around 12 million. When we examine concentrated poverty, which is 40% or more of the neighborhood, we see that it is largely an African American, Latino, and Native American issue in the United States. While it has been over 60 years since the Brown versus Board of Education, over 50 years since the Civil Rights Act, new research is showing that 3 out of 4 African Americans are still living in the most segregated and poorest neighborhoods in the nation. Here's a chart that shows the increase of poverty since 2000. We see in 2000 we're around 7 million, and today we're around 12 million. Often when we talk about concentrated poverty, we do not put it into its historical and social context, which allows for people to ignore the legacy of oppression and confinement that blocked access to upward mobility for many Americans. So we decided to bring some understanding to the forming of concentrated poverty. First, we find it in 3 areas: rural areas, urban cities, and the latest emerging findings are in the suburbs. Let's first start with the rural area. Majority of African Americans who live in concentrated poverty in the rural South live in small towns. These towns were once slave plantations and then turned into sharecropping land. After multiple generations, many African Americans are still living in these areas throughout the South. We also have American Indian reservations where more than half of the residents are poor. The point I'm trying to make here is that the genealogy of concentrated poverty in rural areas can be reached back to the oppression and subjugation of African Americans and American Indians. Over 6 million African Americans showing agency left the Jim Crow South searching for better opportunities. However, the oppression continued. They were confined to certain locations in urban cities. While many whites moved to the suburbs, redlining policies and acts of terror prevented many African Americans from moving to the suburbs. Many Hispanics, on the other hand, settled in gateway cities and established enclaves, and new waves of immigration continued to come. Yes, concentrated poverty is not only in the urban cities, it is also in the suburbs. Between 2000 and 2012, residents living in concentrated poverty grew by 139%, almost 3 times the pace of growth in cities. Ferguson, Missouri is a symbolic place right now, so we decided to use it as an example because it tells a story of people leaving the inner city of St. Louis for hopes of better opportunities in the suburbs. But when they got there, they often settled in concentrated poverty or borderline areas where there is 30 to 40% of concentrated poverty. What we also are discovering, while African Americans have moved into these suburban areas like Ferguson, they are not part of the power structure which continue the social and economic isolation. They are not part of the police departments, the fire departments, the leadership class, and school administrators and teachers. So now that we have examined 3 areas, we find concentrated poverty. We understand that the story is not about freely picking a place to live or just an economic issue, but rather connected to a social historical story about oppression, confinement, and the struggle for agency. So the question is, how does concentrated poverty impact the people who live there? Okay, students in concentrated poverty encounter increased amounts of violence and crime, hyper-incarceration rates, Additional health problems, decayed physical conditions of buildings, excess of fast food and poor housing, and what we find out with Ferguson, different forms of policing. But not only do they encounter different struggles, many are not connected to mainstream institutions. Sociologists often call this social isolation. Many of them do not have the privilege of friends and relatives connecting them to powerful resources and opportunities. In addition, they do not have the privilege of embodying certain behavior, norms, and skills that help people navigate the global world. This is not because they are genetically different, it is because of social isolation. But there is a flip side to social isolation. Many who live outside of concentrated poverty hoard social resources and opportunity. They prefer to give it to people in their own social network, people who look like them, talk and dress like them, while simultaneously allowing for an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities in the United States. Often, whites prefer to give other whites jobs, while attaching social stigma, stereotypes, and negative reputations to schools, communities, and households that are confronted with concentrated poverty. Okay. Sharkey's work really speaks to the inheritance of concentrated poverty. His research asks us to move beyond one generation to understand concentrated poverty. He believes that a mother's child rearing practices are affected by their neighborhood environments and by the environments in which the mothers themselves were raised. When children are exposed to neighborhood inequalities, it maintains concentrated poverty, and this exposure is not only felt in a single lifetime, but it impacts the next generation. But there is agency in the African American communities. Agency, the ability to act for transformation. There are churches, community centers, and local clubs in these areas. There's beauty, richness, passion, care, and love in these communities. I remember when I was conducting field research for my dissertation. It was the love and support that I gained from this poor black community that I could not find in the ivory towers. The community members were so proud that I was working on my PhD. This is why I really question the notion that poor black people do not value education. In my research, I discovered that they do and are looking for pathways to upward mobility. There are knowledges, as Foucauldians might say, narratives, folk tales, dialects that evolve in these neighborhoods. While the dominant society may not value them, I believe that these can be used as pedagogical tools and ways to develop meaningful relationships and partnerships. The remaining of my talk looks at school-based concentrated poverty. Since the Coleman Report, research has shown that a school's social economic background can strongly influence students' achievement. 20 years later, Kennedy's work found that more poverty in a school, the worse off students perform. Even if students are not poor, the concentration of poverty in a school has a negative effect on the overall achievement of students. This continues to show how concentrated poverty, when it is not mitigated in a school, has negative effects on academic achievement. When half a student body is poor, then all students' achievement will suffer. When it is 75%, it will seriously suffer. When both students and their parents grow up in concentrated neighborhood poverty, the impact on school success is magnified. This slide is connected to Sharkey's work. The slide shows 4 different groups of families. The first, parent and child are not in poverty. The second, the parent grew up in poverty. The third, the child grew up in poverty. And the fourth, the parent and child are in poverty. The tests were on reading skills and applied problems. When we compare the average score of the parents who grew up in poverty to only the child in poverty, there is not a big difference. Most of our research has focused only on the child's environments, but this research shows that parents' exposure to poverty is almost as important. In addition, when we compare the average score of students and their parents who were not raised in poverty to the students and their parents who were raised in poverty, we see a 16-point difference, which Sharkey believes that this compares to missing somewhere between 4 and 8 years of schooling. What are some of the mechanisms through which concentrated neighborhood poverty impacts students and school success? Students who live in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty attend school less frequently. They have higher rates of absenteeism and chronic absenteeism. In the lowest income elementary schools, more than 1/3 of the children were chronically absent for 5 years. They also found chronic absenteeism relates with deep poverty, high rates of homelessness, child abuse reports, male unemployment, and low levels of parental education. But also, there is a psychological toll of living in concentrated poverty. Chronic stress associated with living in poverty affects a child's memory, which may impact their ability to learn. The number of students being distracted and stressed by out-of-school struggles is 2 to 3 times higher in areas of concentrated poverty. Teachers reported that students in high concentrated poverty schools encounter more intense economic and social stress. You see by this chart, low concentrated poverty schools were schools that were 0 to 25% of the student population. Low to mixed concentrated poverty schools were 0 to 50% of the school population. And high poverty concentrated poverty schools were 75 to 100% of the student population. Look at the difference between low, mixed, and high concentration of poverty. There's a major difference between the two. The point that I want to make is that when we think about students in concentrated poverty, their everyday journey is different from affluent students. So when we think about policies, school reforms, and instruction, we must keep this in mind. Okay. We also discovered that students who attend schools with a high concentration of poverty lose significant amount of instructional time. A statewide study conducted by the Institute for Democracy at UCLA surveyed school teachers. In these schools, the environments were different. They lacked qualified substitute teachers, often dealt with emergency lockdowns, higher absenteeism of students, and unreliable transportation. 30 minutes of instructional time was lost every day in concentrated poverty schools. Also, higher rates of teacher absenteeism, which led to higher rates of teachers providing class coverage instead of preparing for classes or giving extra help. So the students who dealt with the most economic and social stressors also lost 30 minutes a day in schools of concentrated poverty. Therefore, not only are their parents dealing with double burdens, students also encounter double burdens in their schools. But not only students, teachers are encountering additional burdens in these schools. They perform non-instructional tasks, covering class for absent teachers and discussing community problems. In addition, they have higher suspension and expulsion rates, have higher principal and teacher turnover, less experienced principals and teachers. So when we think about people who live in concentrated poverty, let's move beyond stereotypical images of them to their complex struggles and the double burdens they encounter, which is often connected to a legacy of oppression, confinement, and a struggle for agency.